The wind howled across the barren wasteland as Jeb Carver rode through the night, his horse weary, his bones aching. The desert stretched infinitely in all directions, yet when the clock struck midnight, an impossible structure materialized before him. A saloon standing alone in the dust, its wooden sign swaying with a name burned into the grain, the Midnight Saloon. The light inside flickered invitingly, a respite from the biting cold. Jeb hesitated, his instincts whispering caution, but the thirst in his throat was louder. The doors creaked as he stepped inside, and the moment they shut behind him, a chill ran down his spine. Inside, the air smelled of old whiskey and time-worn regrets. A bartender with hollow eyes greeted him with a slow nod. Drink? Jeb sat at the bar, his boots heavy on the warped floorboards. The whiskey burned, but the warmth it provided was deceptive. The patrons were silent, watching him from the corners of the room, their faces cast in unnatural shadow. He tried to leave once his thirst was quenched, but the doors wouldn't budge. He turned, ready to demand answers, but something in the bartender's expression made his breath hitch. "Welcome, Mr. Carver. Stay a while?" Jeb's skin prickled. "How do you know my name?" The bartender only smiled, pouring another drink. Jeb pounded against the doors, but they would not yield. The saloon was no longer a haven. It was a trap. When he turned, the patrons seemed closer, their shapes less distinct. The bartender poured him another drink. "Every night here has a cost, stranger. A year of your life in return for sanctuary?" Jeb laughed bitterly. "And what if I refuse to stay?" The bartender merely grinned. "Try." Jeb stormed to the door again, but an invisible force repelled him. He was stuck until morning. Swearing under his breath, he downed another whiskey. The room darkened at the edges of his vision, a great exhaustion weighing on his chest. He fought to stay awake, but sleep claimed him. When he awoke, the saloon was gone. He was lying in the dust with his horse grazing nearby. But when he stood, his knees buckled, his muscles screamed. He felt older, weaker. His breath came ragged. 1 year. The cost was real. Determined to break free of the curse, he rode hard through the desert. But when the clock struck midnight, the saloon reappeared, standing just ahead. He yanked on the reins, but his horse refused to turn. As though drawn by an unseen force, he dismounted and stepped inside once more. The bartender was waiting, glass in hand. "Welcome back." Jeb swore he wouldn't return, but when the sun set again, his body betrayed him. The moment midnight struck, the saloon reappeared, standing just ahead. His feet carried him forward against his will, drawn by something unseen. Inside, the bartender welcomed him with a knowing smile. The patrons shifted in their seats, their faces clearer now. Jeb's heart stopped. He recognized them. Men and women he had crossed in his past. A gambler he had cheated in Abilene. A bounty hunter he had shot in the back. A woman whose name he had long since forgotten, her eyes filled with accusations. The whiskey glass trembled in his grip. This some kind of joke? The bartender shook his head. Reckoning. Jeb turned, but the doors were already sealed. The gambler leaned forward, his grin hollow. "Did you think you'd never pay for what you'd done?" Jeb's fingers twitched toward his revolver, but when he reached for it, it wasn't there. The bartender shook his head. "No guns in here, just truth." The bounty hunter raised his glass. "Let's drink to that." Jeb didn't sleep that night. The spectral patrons whispered among themselves, but their voices tangled with memories in his own head. He saw the gambler's face, bloodied from a fight. He remembered the bounty hunter's final gasp. The woman? He had abandoned her, hadn't he? Left her to die. The next night he aged again. His hands trembled, his breath came shallower. And now the spirits spoke to him directly. Their voices blended with his own memories, warping and twisting them until he could no longer tell what was real. He tried to fight it, gripping the bar for support, but the memories were relentless. The gambler leaned closer, his voice like rustling paper. "You took everything from me, Jeb. My money, my pride, left me in the dirt to rot, and now look at you." The bounty hunter loomed over him, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. "You never gave a man a fair chance. Always a bullet in the back, always the coward's way." The woman's voice was the worst, a whisper, soft as the wind. "You left me, Jeb. You left me alone in the cold. I called your name. I waited, but you never came back." Jeb pressed his hands to his ears, but the voices were inside him now. The weight of his sins bore down on his chest, suffocating him. And outside, the desert wind howled, carrying with it the whispers of the dead. He tried everything. He rode away, but the saloon always found him. He refused to enter, but his body betrayed him at midnight. He tried to fight them, but his bullets passed through empty air. The spirits had bound him to this place, and with each night, he lost another year. The bartender watched him with a knowing smile. "You can leave, Jeb," he said one night, pouring another glass. "If you confess." "Confess?" Jeb spat. "Confess what?" The spirits answered in unison. "The truth." Jeb wept as he spoke. He admitted every sin, every betrayal. He spoke of greed, of cowardice, of selfishness. With each confession, the spirits nodded, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. But one remained. The woman. She stepped forward, her spectral form flickering in the dim lantern light. "You don't even remember my name, do you?" she whispered. Jeb opened his mouth, but nothing came. The truth was a blade to the gut. He had killed men. He had cheated and stolen. But forgetting her? That was the worst of all. Her face twisted in sorrow. "Then you can't leave," Jeb screamed, reaching for her, but she vanished. The bartender poured him another drink. "You should have remembered." Jeb never left. The weight of years pressed against him, turning his once strong frame frail. His hands, which had once drawn faster than any outlaw in the West, now trembled against the wooden bar. He did not count the years anymore. The concept of time blurred within the saloon. Whether a decade had passed or a century, he could no longer tell. The only certainty was midnight, when new souls would arrive, and the cycle would begin anew. Each night, the doors swung open. Men and women of all kinds stepped in, some desperate, some weary, all seeking shelter from the cruel desert. Jeb watched them the way the others had once watched him. He saw the way their hands fidgeted, their eyes darting to the exits. He knew the panic that would set in when they realized they could not leave. He tried to warn them at first. When the first desperate drifters arrived, he whispered to them, "Turn back while you can." But the bartender had only grinned. The moment they took a drink, it was too late. The weight of the saloon, of its curse, claimed them. He no longer spoke. It made no difference. Every man who sat at the bar was doomed. Every woman who sought refuge became a specter in waiting. He understood now why the others had watched him in silence when he had first arrived. They had seen their own past in him, and now he saw his own past in each new guest. He was part of the saloon now, the eternal patron. The bartender refilled his glass, and Jeb stared at the amber liquid, the only thing in this godforsaken place that still held color. "The price was paid," the bartender murmured. Jeb lifted the glass to his lips. Somewhere deep inside him, something screamed. A part of him still yearned to fight, to escape, but the saloon had hollowed him out. The drink burned his throat, but he barely felt it. The doors swung open again. Another traveler, a younger man, wild-eyed, desperate. Jeb turned, meeting the man's gaze. He saw himself reflected there. "Welcome to the Midnight Saloon," Jeb said. His voice was hollow. "Stay a while." And the cycle continued.